So, what is goat versus fish?
Goat versus fish brings the verses to you. We promise the verses we tell you are true. What's goat versus fish? You haven't a clue. But it is something to do. Do. It is something to do, and it comes from within you. What is goat versus fish? Who is goat versus fish? Why is goat versus fish? There is only one true question. There is only one true question.
What is goat versus fish?
Well, we just told you that versus. What is goat versus fish is one of the true false questions, one of the true false questions of goat versus fish. But if you wish to really talk about goat versus fish in that kind of verses, everything is goat versus fish. Everywhere is goat versus fish. You are goat versus fish. You are a goat or a fish, but you are part of goat versus fish, and goat versus fish is a part of you. And of course, in the beginning, there was goat versus fish. Look around you. Don't you see the goat and fish? Don't you just see the goat and fish? Everything is goat versus fish. Everywhere is goat versus fish. Every when is goat versus fish. It's all goat versus fish. It's all goat versus fish. And now Ron is goat versus fish. Now your podcast is goat versus fish.
Yes. So when I answered whether I was goat or fish, I think it was at a WonderCon or something similar, but it was at some event like that. I saw you going by, and I said it's goat versus fish, and then you stopped and you asked me if I was a goat or a fish. Do you remember or no?
Goat versus fish. Well, we have spoken to thousands upon tens of thousands, perhaps millions of goat and fish. And of course, we recognition you from the comedy places, and we have seen you in front of the doors. We have seen you in front of and behind the doors and all over that verses. And goat versus fish does remember WonderCon, it is true, but goat versus fish pitiably does not specifically recall speaking to you. We do not remember if you are goat or fish. It's a whole new verses. It's a whole new verses for goat versus fish.
Well, that's
but
okay.
Of course, we have seen you about. And speaking of convention, goat versus fish just did return from Los Angeles Comic Con, where goat versus fish continues to go to the convention and record extra high definition 4K goat versus fish for YouTube consumption.
Was it a good fest for you? Did you enjoy it? I didn't get to make it. I wanted to go.
Well, there is no good or evil, only goat and fish, but it was very goat versus fish. There were many who recognized goat versus fish. As a matter of verses, there was one small one who came up to goat versus fish, and they said, back when I was a kid, trust goat versus fish, they were still quite small, but they said to goat versus fish, back when I was a kid 5 years ago at LA Comic Con, I was so afraid. It was my first convention, and I was looking about, and I was overwhelmed and scared, but then I had an interaction with goat versus fish, and everything was pleasant, and after that versus, I had many celebrations. I had many celebrations and enjoyed the convention. So we found ones that recognized goat versus fish from 5 years ago, from 1 year ago, from the comedy places, from punk shows with goat versus fish. There were many who knew goat versus fish. There were many who did not know goat versus fish. But we got many new followers, and it was a celebration. It was a celebration.
That's cool. No, I got a kick. I mean, we initially met at the Ice House in Pasadena.
Celebration. Oh, yes. Oh, were you on a show with goat versus fish?
Yeah, we were on a show together. And
we recall that versus. We recall that versus, yes.
Yeah, and then I ran into you. It might not have been, but it was something like a WonderCon. I ran into you. You were streaming, and my friend who I was with, had no idea what it was that you did. So I got a big kick out of it because I was kind of familiar, and I was like, "This is the goat versus fish guy," and so I said that, and I still say that I'm a fish because
celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish.
Thank you. So yeah, I appreciate it. I got my fish there. The the reason I chose fish is because I love the water. I live near the water. I've always been a big just water enthusiast. I love the beach, which is there right behind you, and yeah, and I like to travel. I like to be like I guess I'm a Sagittarius, and so yeah, I picked fish, and I want to know like is my assessment there sound?
You may choose goat or fish for whatever you wish. It is not even for goat versus fish to give you permission to be goat or to be fish. It is up to you, and it is not just to you, Ron. Anyone who is listening, anyone who is perceiving goat versus fish, it is up to you and you alone to choose goat or fish. Goat versus fish will never tell you if you are a goat or a fish, just that you are a goat or a fish. And there is but one versus. There is one bit of fencery, however, one bit of fenciness, and that is you mentioned a Sagittarius to goat versus fish. But you see, it is not for the stars to declare what you are. It is not for the stars to declare what you are, as if we can look up into the sky where the fence is high, and some glowing celestial orb that is not even nearly as old as goat versus fish would dictate to you if you are a goat or a fish. This is a false versus. Goat versus fish comes from within you. It is for you and you to say alone if you are goat or if you are fish.
Okay, fair enough. So all of
Anyone would look upon a star to determine what it is that they think that they are. You need not look very far, their contemplations are subpar. Are you goat or are you fish?
Nice. So I still my answer is still fish, but my astrological sign, yeah. So
If you wish, if one truly wishes to gaze into the stars and see that they are fish, as long as they truly accept from within themselves that they are fish, goat versus fish will accept this versus. As long as you comprehension, it is up to you to choose goat or fish. It is up to you. If you accept what the stars have told you that you are, that is you who have chosen fish. It is not the stars. It is not the stars.
No,
the stars
I feel
can
ya.
choose for themselves, of course.
Absolutely. No, I'm not a big astrology guy. I just like there's certain stereotypical Sagittarius things that apply to me. Like I love to travel and stuff like that. So I kind of just threw that in there. But my answer is still fish. So
Celebration for fish. Many speak of the astronology to goat versus fish. That is often a frequent interpretation of goat versus fish. But we must tell them that astrology is merely an interpretation of goat versus fish, not the reverses.
Okay. All right. I like that. So what are you? Are you a goat or a fish?
Goat versus fish is never gonna answer that question. Oh, I've tried to ask goat versus fish so many times. Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? But goat versus fish, like any common internet troll, refuses to answer this very simple question. I can't even believe you're wasting your time interviewing goat versus fish. You think you're gonna get an answer out of this guy? You must be dumber than you look. Hey, now listen to me, goat versus fish. Listen to me. We are having one who welcomes goat versus fish. We are a guest in this versus. We are a guest of Ron, and we do not appreciate what it is that you have going on. You should choose goat or fish. You should choose goat or fish and not be so rude to the ones who welcome goat versus fish. Forgive goat versus fish. Forgive goat versus fish. The fence sitter does not like that goat versus fish gets all the attention and gets all the questions. They just wish they could be goat versus fish and have all the exciting popularity of goat versus fish.
So is the shrimp is a fence sitter?
Well, it has not chosen goat or fish. Whenever we ask it if it is goat or fish, it has not chosen goat or fish. It could choose goat or fish whenever it wishes. Goat versus fish did know a shrimp once who was calling itself a shrimp for many verses, but then after years of goat versus fish, it finally declared fish. It finally declared fish, and it was a celebration for fish. Whenever a fence sitter gets off the fence, it is a celebration. It is a celebration.
Well, are you a fence sitter then? Because you don't answer.
Well, it is usually the fence sitter who accuses goat versus fish of sitting on the fence. It is always the fence sitter. You're not on the fence, are you? You are not
No,
on
I'm
the fence,
fish.
are you? Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. has been known at some verses to be the goat, has been known at some verses to be the fish. But of course, we simply are goat versus fish. 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 We simply, ooh, look there, it says goat versus fish. We simply are goat versus fish. We simply are goat versus fish. We are goat versus fish. The one true versus. But never on the fence. No, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is not a fence sitter. Just look at goat versus fish. Clearly, we are goat versus fish.
Is goat versus fish pre-biblical?
In the beginning, there was goat versus fish, and the biblicals does claim in their verses, in the beginning, some fence sitter sitting on high created the universe and some such fenciness, and then they had a child born in a manger of goat who created a bunch of fish, but then died being nailed to a fence. We think that is the story we have heard. But of course, they were just copying goat versus fish. They were just copying goat versus fish. In the beginning, there was goat versus fish, and goat versus fish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. That is the true verses. That's the true verses. That's the true verses. And any of those other verses that would say that goat versus fish is the false verses, they are the false verses. Goat versus fish is the true verses.
So where has goat versus fish been throughout history? I mean, will goat versus fish interfere with any world conflicts? Will goat versus fish try to help us reach world peace? Or is goat versus fish just agnostic to that and human beings need to decide for themselves?
Goat versus fish is very curious. Goat versus fish is very curious, and this is not the first world that has been visited by goat versus fish. We have been all throughout the universe. We have been the universe itself. Goat versus fish just wants to know if you are goat or fish. We want to know if this is goat or fish. We want to know if what all objects and all things and all persons, as you would call them, are goat or fish. Everything is a goat or a fish. Even the small atomizations that would make up your very self, those are also goat or fish. Perhaps they are fish because you are fish and it is all part of making up the fish. But that is for you and you or others to deduce. Goat versus fish, we'll ask them all. But we do suppose, goat versus fish, we do suppose, though the goat and fish are free to verses as they wish, goat versus fish is clear on one verses. Goat versus fish does not endorse a violence between a goat and a fish. Goat versus fish does not endorse a violence between a goat and fish. Why? Because we want the goat and fish to be very healthy goat and fish so that they can versus forever, If the goat and fish become so harmed that they can no longer versus one another, well, then that's less goat versus fish. And we always want more goat versus fish. And we do suppose that there are many false verses out there. We have witnessed them. Arguing over falseness, whether it is, what is this, Demlicans versus Republicrats, or whether it is, they're in the Middle East right now. There are horrible violences going on. If only they realized that goat versus fish was the true verses, then they would dispense with their falseness, and then they would just celebration, and they would just be goat versus fish. And we think that they would be a lot happier and healthier if they realized it was goat versus fish. But the goal of goat versus fish is merely for you to choose goat or fish, for you to follow goat versus fish, and for you to tell everyone that you know about goat versus fish. That's the whole verses.
Is goat versus fish the path to enlightenment?
Let us see. Is goat versus fish the path to enlightenment? Well, the first verse is, that is an interesting verse for goat versus fish. We do not even know if enlightenment is a goat or a fish. That would be the first question of goat versus fish. But we think that if you are a fish, as you have said that you are, the path to goat versus fish is to find your goat to verses. Now, this is not your forever goat. Just in each verses, you may have a goat. Some goat that is versing you. You may be attempting to ignore it. You may be attempting to think, I could easily triumph this goat, but you never lift a fin to do it. We implore you to find the goat, versus the goat, and triumph. Attempt to triumph. Perhaps you will not triumph. Many goat are mighty. But do not ignore the goat in your verses. Do not sit on the fence. We implore you simply to be more goat versus fish, to do more goat versus fish, If this leads to enlightenment, then please tell us if enlightenment is a goat or a fish. But Goat versus Fish does not claim to be enlightened. We only claim to be Goat versus Fish.
Can goat marry fish, and can fish marry goat, or can two fishes marry? Can two goats marry?
Celebration, of course! Goat and fish can marry one another, and a fish can marry a fish, and a goat can marry a goat, as long as it's a merry goat versus fish. Two goats marrying one another, they can versus the fish together, stronger as one. Or a goat and fish to come together to form the unity of goat fish. Or maybe they just want to be goat versus fish for all verses. Yes, of course. How you marry one another, goat versus fish, is not as concerned with this marriage, as you say. We just want the goat and fish to be so happy together. So yes, they may do as they wish. Goat can be with goat, fish can be with fish. A goat may even marry a fence sitter if they wish, but we really would hope that that fence sitter would at least choose fish so that they could be goat versus fish. It would be a celebration.
Can two fence sitters get together?
Oh, the fence sitters love to get together. Oh, you should see them. The fence sitters, they love to link posts. They love to link posts and make a fence, make a really, really long fence, make a really, really long fence. But we have found that even as the fence sitters attempt to come together, that they are always undermining themselves because the fence sitter just thinks they are so special. Oh, I'm the special fence sitter. I'm the special fence sitter who doesn't have to choose goat or fish. I'm the special fence sitter, so each fence sitter, they become not so trusting of one another. And so even though they try to come together, really, they are all alone. Being on the fence is a very lonely versus. It's a very lonely versus up on that fence. If only they could be part of Goat versus Fish. If only they could be part of Goat versus Fish.
You have talked to, as you said, thousands and thousands of people, asking them if they are goat or fish.
That is no exaggeration.
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, I've seen some of your live streams, and you just go to huge events like Comic-Cons and stuff like that. What are some of the more memorable answers you've gotten over the years?
Memorable answers of Goat versus Fish. Memorable answers to Goat versus Fish. It is difficult for Goat versus Fish to remember. Pitiably, many of the fence sitters, their post seems to stick in the ponderings of Goat versus Fish. There have been ones who we met at the Versus of Venice Beach, where they did not like Goat versus Fish, and they threatened Goat versus Fish. They threatened to harm Goat versus Fish just for singing songs of celebration, just for singing Goat versus Fish is live at the beach. And they said, stop, Goat versus Fish, stop, Goat versus Fish. You are angering me, Goat versus Fish. But then Goat versus Fish returned later in the verses, and they gained a respect for Goat versus Fish and chose Goat. And we said, celebration for Goat. And of course, there are very, very memorable Goat and Fish. There was another fence sitter. There was that Vernon subpar. No, it was Vernon Supreme. Yes, Goat versus Fish had a debate with Vermin Supreme, and they would not choose Goat or Fish, and then they did not like Goat versus Fish, and now they think that Goat versus Fish has it all against that fence sitter, who will never be president. Vernon Supreme will never be president. It will be Goat versus Fish. But they somehow think that Goat versus Fish is how to versus them or something, and we do not really comprehend what they have against Goat versus Fish. And there have been, Angelo Moore of Fishbone. Angelo Moore of Fishbone at the Green Jello show at the Whiskey A Go-Go. We thought surely Angelo Moore of Fishbone is fish, but they claimed goat,
Whoa.
Oh, my virgins, who would have expected a Fishbone to be goat? Who would have expected this? You just never know what's going to happen on Goat versus Fish.
Yeah, that had to throw you for a loop. I didn't know you had a run-in with Vermin Supreme. I mean, Goat versus Fish stays out of human politics, right? I mean, that's not.
Well, Goat versus Fish does not so much stay out of it. It is more that we want to make it into Goat versus Fish.
Okay.
And we want the ones who are politicizing to realize that really what they are doing is actually Goat versus Fish. If the Demlicans and Republicrats really comprehended that it was not Donkus versus Effluent, but that really it was Goat versus Fish, we think a lot more verses could be happening. A lot more verses could be happening now. They think it's not Goat versus Fish, but it's definitely Goat versus Fish.
So you mentioned how unification is possible, like a goat-fish unification. But break that down for me. How is that possible?
The unity of GoatVsFish. It is both a simple and a difficult verse, is the unity of GoatVsFish, the unity of GoatVsFish. You see, when a goat and fish come together and they wish to dispense with the verses and they wish to dispense with the verses, yes, they can. Yes, they can. Really, it is just a verses of if this goat says to this fish, I want to form the unity of GoatVsFish. And this fish says, I want to form the unity of GoatVsFish with goat. And if they agree to form the unity of GoatVsFish, then they can form the unification of GoatVsFish. But both goat and fish have to agree to form the unity of GoatVsFish. If either the goat or the fish disagrees, then it is goat versus fish. Then it is goat versus fish. The real verses that makes it difficult is that some think that they can achieve unification alone. It is often the fence sitter who says, I am GoatVsFish. Look at me. I am GoatVsFish, as if they think that they are goat versus fish. I am GoatVsFish. I am GoatVsFish. I do not want to take sides. I representation of harmony. But it is quite simple. It is quite simple for one to sit on a fence themselves and say that I myself am for unification. It is another versus entirely for a goat and a fish to actually come together to dispense with the verses and to form the unity of GoatVsFish in spite of the verses that they are goat and fish. That is a difficult verses. To claim it for oneself, that's a simple thing. But for a goat and fish to actually come together, that is where the real verses is.
So to be clear, like using myself as an example, I am a fish and I don't see that change. Thank you. So let's say I change my mind at some point. I feel like I'm a goat. So I once was a fish. Now I'm a goat. Could I then say I'm a goat fish after that? I've been both a fish and a goat.
You can say that you have had the experience of being a fish and that you have this knowledge you have gained from being fish. And you can say, wait a versus, are you trying to become goat? Are you trying to become goat live on Ron's podcast of the thousands?
No, I am fish. I am definitely fish. I'm just trying to understand. Like I'm just trying to make sure I have the full grasp on the unification concept.
Well, so I'm asking again, it is for a goat. It is for a goat and a fish. A goat and a fish, or it could be 2 goat and 1 fish, or 3 fish and 5 goat. But it is for at least 1 goat and 1 fish to come together to form the unity of GoatVsFish. It cannot be done alone. So if you were a fish, and then later in the verses, you become goat, we say celebration for goat, we say celebration for goat. A fish can become goat, a goat can become fish, but that means that you are a fish that became a goat, or that you are a goat who was a fish, but that does not make you GoatVsFish. At most, it makes you a goat who has had the experience of being fish.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a knowledge of fish. This is a knowledge of fish, though beware, other goats, your fellow goats, may rejection you and say, oh, you used to be fish. We no longer accept you as goat. Or there may be some goat who say, celebration, celebration, the fish has become goat. And there are some other fish who may think, perhaps that goat is actually still secret fish. It is spy goat. It is spy goat. That is for you to communication with your fellow goat and fish to determine how they perceive you. But when you declare goat to goat versus fish, it is celebration for goat. And when you declare fish to goat versus fish, it is celebration for fish. We accept you as you are. Just don't sit on the fence. Don't sit on the fence. But we accept you as you are, of course, if you're goat or fish.
I feel confident in my fish stance. I'm definitely
celebration.
But how often do you see people kind of switching it up? Have you seen some successful fish to goats, successful goats to fish? Does it happen?
Oh, yes, every versus. Just at the LA Comic Con, we went on Fry versus, Satyrverse, and Sunverses, and there were some goat who became fish from Satyrverse to Sunverses, and there were some goat who stayed goat, and some fish who became goat, and vice versa. And some have been goat for many years, but then in one brief verses, they become a fish. We see it all over the verses. We see staunch goat and fish. We see ones who are going between goat and fish. But of course, if they are going goat fish, 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 if they are merely hyperversing between goat and fish so quickly that we cannot even perceive in a single verses if they are goat or fish, then this is a form of fence sitting. This is a form of fence sitting, it is true.
Okay, that's interesting. So you can be indecisive to the point of you are just a fence sitter.
True verses, yes. Indecision is
Hmm.
one of the verses, one of the pitiable verses of fence sitters is indecision. And some, of course, we suspect are simply trying to fence around with goat versus fish. They're saying, "Oh, I'm a goat. Oh, I'm a fish. Oh, I'm a goat. Oh, I'm a fish." But they do not really seem to believe what it is they are saying. They are just trying to confuse goat versus fish. They are not taking goat versus fish very seriously.
Has anybody ever successfully confused goat versus fish?
Oh yes, oh yes. Goat versus fish is confused every verses. Goat versus fish is very confused. That is why we need to know if everything is goat or fish. If goat versus fish was somehow omniscient and just knew if everything was goat or fish, then we would not need to ask if everyone is goat or fish. So goat versus fish is very confused by how you are conducting yourself on this place that you call Earth. You definitely should be more goat versus fish. And the less it's goat versus fish, the more you confuse yourselves and the more you confuse goat versus fish.
Does goat versus fish have any book recommendations?
Well, goat versus fish. It was written that it was goat versus fish. Let us ponder. Let us ponder. Let us ponder. Book recommendations. Book recommendations by goat versus fish. That is a fascination. Well, there is. We do want to know if Moby Dick is a goat or a fish. It would seem to be a book about a fish. It seems to be about fish, the classic fish verses. But then whales are sort of fence sitters, aren't they? They seem to breathe the air in like a goat. And so it could be just the story of epic fence-on-fence violence, which is not endorsed by goat versus fish. But any book that has a goat and any book that has a fish is recommended by goat versus fish. We are constantly looking at all media, searching for references to goat and searching for references to fish. And we celebration every reference about goat and fish. But you have posed an excellent verses to goat versus fish. Many ask goat versus fish about movies. They ask goat versus fish, but rarely has one asked about literature to goat versus fish. We should find more goat and fish books, more goat and fish books to learn about goat versus fish. But definitely do not read the book of the flying spaghettish monstrosity. Don't read the book of the flying spaghettish monstrosity. That's totally a false verses. That's totally a false verses. Don't read that.
Well, does goat versus fish have any music recommendations?
Well, goat versus fish, if you search Spotify for goat versus fish, then you will see that there is one who is called Thunder Tracks, who has made goat versus fish loops, songs of goat versus fish. And of course, we have our own songs, original goat versus fish, of course. Between you and goat versus fish, all songs were inspired by goat versus fish. But if you want musical recommendations, then we would just sing you a song of goat versus fish right this very verses. But
I
of
would
course,
love that.
Celebration, then we shall do just this. And while we are making preparation, of course, there is the band Fish, there's the band Fish, and the Beach Boys, Where the Land Meets the Sea, and Pet Sounds has goats on the cover, and there is Country Joe and the Fish, and there is a band, there's a Swedish band called Goat. So there are a lot of goat and fish bands. There are a lot of goat and fish bands out there. Do you be goat? 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 Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Or do you be fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat are up land and fish are up the sea. But what kind of goat or fish do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be goat or a fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Goat versus fish, yes. Repeat after goat versus fish. Doobie 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 doobie.
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 Doobie 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 doobie.
Doobie 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 doobie.
Doobie goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, or doobie fish, a doobie goat, or a fish, because the goat, doobie goat, and the fish, doobie fish, the pitiable fence sitter sits on the fence. But the goat do be goat, and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish?
Celebration. Yeah, celebration.
Celebration. That was a song of goat versus fish, and there are others still,
That was excellent. So there's one other thing I wanted to ask you about, and I don't follow Kill Tony much. I don't know much about it, to tell you the truth. I know it's very popular, but your clip is one that I've watched multiple times. Could you share kind of your memory of that? What was your experience like doing that show?
It was at the Comedy Store, Los Angeles, back when Killing Tony was there, and before they made their verses all the way to Austin. And Goat versus Fish went to the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and we did Make It Written, Goat versus Fish, versed for both Potluck, which is an open microphone at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and also we made it written Goat versus Fish, signing up for Killing Tony as well. And by the power of Goat versus Fish got on both Potluck and Kill Tony in the same verses. It was quite a celebration.
Okay.
Killing Tony looked at it, and of course we were Goat versus Fish. It is always Goat versus Fish, so we were waiting as Goat versus Fish. And they looked and they said, and Killing Tony said in that sort of squeaky, fancy voice that they have, oh, I hope this is real. And as soon as we heard this, we knew that they were reading Goat versus Fish. Oh, this next one coming up, I hope this is real. Goat versus Fish? And there were some in the audience that made celebrations, and there were others in the audience who went, oh no, it's Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish entered, and we had but one thing to ponder. At that versus, Goat versus Fish had only been, as you perceive Goat versus Fish in standing up comedy, about a year of Goat versus Fish. Okay. But we knew we had but one versus. It was not to make the Goat and Fish laugh. It was not even to entertain the Goat and Fish. Our versus was simple. Be Goat versus Fish. Be Goat versus Fish. And only be Goat versus Fish. And sure enough, they attempted to break Goat versus Fish. But as long as Goat versus Fish remained Goat versus Fish, then we knew it would be a triumph. And it was a triumph of Goat versus Fish. If you listen again, if you watch again, you will see every question they ask Goat versus Fish is an attempt to break down Goat versus Fish. But Goat versus Fish will have none of it. It remains Goat versus Fish. They cannot defeat Goat versus Fish. And Tony Hinch-Clifton did not even answer if they were Goat or Fish. Very pitiable. Fence sitters! Did
anyone answer if they were Goat or Fish? I mean, my memory of watching it was you actually pissed a few people off, it seemed like.
It does seem so.
And I don't know if anyone answered if they were goat or fish or not.
Well, not up there on the stage did no one answer if they were Goat or Fish, though drummer Joel Jimenez did answer and say that they were Goat at a future versus that was not recorded at that podcasting.
Okay.
But they did not say, and yes, they were angry at Goat versus Fish. They were so, as you say, pissed off at Goat versus Fish, were some of them. But of course, there are many who are pissed off at Kill Tony. Every versus, it is almost as if they are trying to invoke anger in some of the ones who would watch Killing Tony. It is almost as if it was very on brand for Goat versus Fish. So Goat versus Fish goes and gives them a taste of their own verses, and then they say, oh no, we can't handle this. No, we are offended by Goat versus Fish. They take offense at Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish thinks that they should do some introspection and choose Goat or Fish.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not. I don't watch it. I'm not super familiar with it, but your appearance was one of the few clips I caught and found it very intriguing.
Goat versus Fish goes live on Twitch and live on Kick, and even out there at the conventions. Always, inevitably, at some verses, someone be they goat or fish, will come up to Goat versus Fish and say, I remember you from Kill Tony. Oh, my versus.
Sure.
It's Goat versus Fish from Kill Tony. It still happens to this versus. So Goat versus Fish does say appreciation to Kill Tony. Thank you for welcoming Goat versus Fish. We would appear again whenever you wish. And yes, that clip of Goat versus Fish has been viewed hundreds of thousands of times on the YouTube. And yet still, fence sitters who think that they are even half as clever as Tony Hinchclifton will say to Goat versus Fish, they will say, Goat versus Fish. Oh, you are the one who appeared on Kill Tony all those years ago, and now nobody remembers you. Ha ha, how pitiful, Goat versus Fish. And yet, the one who is speaking to Goat versus Fish to tell us about how no one remembers Goat versus Fish clearly remembers Goat versus Fish because they are telling Goat versus Fish about that versus from 5 years ago. We have been called cringe. We have been called bizarre. We have been called all of these things, but one versus remains true. They can't stop watching Goat versus Fish. They can't stop looking at Goat versus Fish. They can't stop thinking about Goat versus Fish. And this is a celebration of Goat versus Fish.
All right. Well, plug everything you want to plug in closing. Where can people go to learn more about you? Where could they catch Goat versus Fish?
On the Instagram, on the Twitterverse, on the Book of Faces, on YouTubes, and live on Twitch, and live on Kick, and out there in the universe, and Goat versus Fish at the conventions. If there's any convention, Comic-Con event that you wish Goat versus Fish, it does not need to be a convention. It could be the Renaissance Fair that Goat versus Fish was kicked out of once. Anywhere where you want to see an appearance of Goat versus Fish, then just send a message to Goat versus Fish and say, oh, will you be here? Will you be there? And perhaps Goat versus Fish will go there, or maybe just wandering around the beaches of Venice. Do not hesitation to reach out to Goat versus Fish. We will be there for you.
How did you get kicked out of Renaissance Fair?
Oh, for so many verses, the ones still say, oh, you should go to the Ren Fair, Goat versus Fish. You would fit right in, Goat versus Fish. So Goat versus Fish drove all the way to the Ren Fair in the Goat versus Fish mobile. And then Goat versus Fish, they looked strangely at Goat versus Fish, and they said, okay, we'll let you in the verses. And Goat versus Fish entered, and we found the first one we could perceive, and we said, are you Goat or are you Fish? And they said, Fish, and another one said Goat, and as we do, Goat versus Fish, if it's a goat, we say, celebration for Goat, and we give them this card that says Goat, and then it says, are you Goat or Fish? Follow Goat versus Fish on all social media at Goat versus Fish. And not after we had once or twos of these conversations, this one comes up all officially, or perhaps a goatily, to Goat versus Fish, and says, you can't be here. You cannot be here. You cannot be distributing these business cards, Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish said, oh, okay, we did not know. Then we will no longer distribution the cards. You have the promise of Goat versus Fish. No cards shall be distributed from now on. Okay. And they said, no, still no, still you have to go. You just have to go. You just have to leave this place. And so Goat versus Fish, of course, we left the place. We do not wish to go where Goat versus Fish is not welcome. Some may be annoyed by Goat versus Fish, though many more are enjoyed by Goat versus Fish. But Goat versus Fish does wish to be welcome wherever we go. The more welcome is Goat versus Fish, the more we can spread the verses of Goat versus Fish. And so they said, go away, Goat versus Fish. And so we did. But perhaps we will return again. Perhaps we will return again one of these verses.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I don't know why they couldn't just let you hang out. But thank you so much for doing this. And look forward to crossing paths with you again.
Always thank Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish does do monthly shows in recent verses, monthly shows at the clubhouse as well. So we would be pleased to welcome you to join Goat versus Fish, or to join Goat versus Fish for a living stream. And perhaps you can even talk some of that politicalization that you are so fond of to Goat versus Fish. We can tell you a few verses of Goat versus Fish, as we did debate Vernon Supreme. We can tell you that Goat versus Fish is in favor of universal basic verses. We want a verses for every goat and a verses for every fish. Goat versus Fish wants to simplification the census. The census will be replaced with one question. Are you goat or are you fish? It will be a one question census, and everyone in Verse America will answer if they are goat or fish. Goat versus Fish will tear down the fences. Goat versus Fish will tear down the fences. We say choose goat or fish, all you fence builders out there. Goat versus Fish wants to tear down the fence. They just want to build fences so they can sit on them and point and laugh at Goat versus Fish and not choose goat or fish. So it is down with fences, and Goat versus Fish will change the code of taxation. Very simple. Just give all of your money to Goat versus Fish. It seems only to burden you. Just give all your money to Goat versus Fish. It will be a much simpler policy if you just give all of your money to Goat versus Fish. These are some of the positions of Goat versus Fish. These are some of the positions of Goat versus Fish. And if you ever have politicalization questions to ask Goat versus Fish, we are well versed. We are well versed in Goat versus Fish versus Goat versus Fish.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for doing this, and I look forward to crossing paths with you in the future.
Thank you for having Goat versus Fish be one of your 1,000, one of 1,000 of many of the millions of verses of Goat versus Fish. And it was written, and it was written. Thank you, Ron, for welcoming Goat versus Fish celebration.